be respectful of other attendees. Any offensive behavior or questions will result in being kicked out of the session. This is also part of a virtual event series, Books in Common Northwest, and we have plenty of other exciting events scheduled all summer. You can go to booksincommonnw.com to view a full calendar, which is updated regularly. And we are here first and foremost to support our guests and their books. And the best way to do that is to purchase their work. We'll be dropping a link into the chat throughout the show to do just that. And there's also a Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your own questions and vote on other questions that you'd most like to hear. We'll get to as many as time allows. And with all of that out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests for the evening. Kim Stafford is a writer and teacher in Oregon and the founding director of the Northwest Writing Institute at Lewis and Clark College. He is the author of numerous collections of poetry, a biography, a children's book, and a book about writing and teaching. He co-founded the annual Fish Trap Writers Gathering in Oregon and teaches regularly at the Hugo House in Seattle. In 2018, he was named Oregon's Poet Laureate for a 2-year term. Hoahwah is a Yapatuka Comanche Southern Arapaho and received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Arkansas. He has published 2 collections of his work, Night Cradle and Velroy and the Medici Mafia. In 2013, Sai was a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. Last but not least, Kathleen Flenniken won the Washington State Book Award for her poetry collection, Plume. Her first book, Famous, won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Poetry and was named a notable book by the American Library Association. Flenniken's other awards include a Pushcart Prize and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and Artists Trust. She served as Washington State Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we get off to hearing you all share some of your poetry, I wanted to start off with a question that also involves a confession of my own, and that is that I am not, or at least I do not consider myself a person of poetry. I certainly have poems that have resonated with me in the past, and there have been times in my life where I'll come home from the bookstore with a stack of 10 poetry collections, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it this time, and then I fall off for one reason or another. And I also want to say that in preparing for this event with each of your books, you three may be responsible for converting me, because I was just absolutely transfixed by all 3 of these, and am looking forward to getting my hands on just more collections of poetry. But in the spirit of National Poetry Month, I'm curious what each of you would have to say to the Lane of a week ago, or others who might feel the same way in being intimidated or feeling that they don't know how to read poetry. And I'll kick it over to Kim to get us started.
Yeah, thank you, Lane. I'm thinking of an essay by E.B. White that begins, "Why can't the poets be clearer?" shouts my wife from the other room. Hers is a universal longing, and then he goes into, well, what is it with poetry? Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's mysterious, opaque. And, people who say I don't like poetry, that's sort of like saying I don't like people. Well, yeah, there's some people that may set you off, but then you meet a lively one. And I think the world of poetry is so various. There's a room in the house of poetry for every reader. Wordsworth said, the most important poetry will be uttered by ordinary people at times of great emotion. So I think of poetry as our native language. It's when someone speaks the truth in a brief, evocative way to you, you've experienced poetry. So that's a start.
Fantastic start. Sai, do you have any comments?
Wow. To add to that wonderful expression about poetry, poetry, it's definitely its own animal, but yet it's not animal that, it's not an animal you can't control or, or reason with, or, I always thought of poetry as, the raw expression, your first response to the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Well, Lane, I was you. I actually didn't start reading poetry until my 30s. So I was also late to the party. And what changed it for me was I checked out a book from the library. I was drawn to a particular anthology. I brought it home. And I gave myself permission to like poems and not like poems, and not think that there was something wrong with me if I didn't like it. So in one afternoon, I went from being afraid of poems to loving what I was loving and not liking what I didn't like and not judging myself for it. So I think it's kind of like giving yourself permission to have your own tastes. And to me, it's like music, that if you don't like country western or you don't like rap, that doesn't mean you don't like music. It just means you have a particular sensibility. And maybe if you really start studying music, you might like more and more kinds. And that's what's happened to me with poetry. I've expanded what it is I love as I've grown to know more about it. So yeah, that's kind of my very personal answer.
Yeah, could I add something, Lane? My predecessor, the eighth Poet Laureate of Oregon, Elizabeth Woody, who's Wasco Navajo, she said at a reading one time, the more I do poetry, the less it's about what the poem is, and the more about who the poem serves. So, when Sai says, poetry is an animal, I love that. It's a little bit feral, and sometimes it comes up to you and licks your hand, and other times it might bite you, so you don't know. And I love what Kathleen is saying about you have a right to not like some poems. It doesn't mean you don't like poetry. You maybe just haven't found the one that is for you.
Right. Yeah, I think there is a degree of it being all lumped together in a misunderstanding of how varied it can be. But with all of that said, I would love to ask each of you to share a poem with us, and we'll do some more sharing later on in the evening. Sai, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Let's see here. I'll read. This poem's entitled Definitive Bright Morning. And I guess you can say this is a poem for the sake of a poem. Noted to be the definitive bright morning of 10,000 calendars. The church bell melted. Rage of an unrequited love became a terrible serpent. The morning star lowered like an enemy's flag. A vampire's mattress tumbled out at the outskirts of town. Ancient lanterns suddenly thrown through the air somewhere deep in the mountains. That night, in a snowy rural area, an elderly powder-faced woman appeared on doorsteps in search of wine. And her origins neatly wrapped in the cold dressing of a snowflake's breath.
Beautiful. Okay. And Kathleen?
Okay. This is called Horse Latitudes. And this is the name of the gyre in the Pacific that is filled with so much garbage. Horse Latitudes. A raft of debris as large as Africa accumulates in the Pacific gyre. Trash, plastic, rope, netting, a synthetic sea of flotsam that will outlive us all. Few ships enter. A windless ocean strikes terror in the crew. If you can't imagine the camera pulling back until we see the curve of the earth, pulling back to reveal the atmosphere's blue glow and still not bounding the garbage. If we can't acknowledge the damage done, Then recall your secret hurt that churns and churns and won't diminish. A spiral so huge, your mind mutinies and denies it all.
Thank you. Kim?
Yeah, this is a poem I wrote for an inmate in an Oregon prison who called a friend of mine when the pandemic came and said, "Johnny, I'm worried about you. You know, I'm used to lockdown, but you're not. Are you going to be okay?" And I was just so moved by this inmate's compassion for someone on the outside. So it's called "Inmate Calls Home." Mom, I've been all night worried. This virus thing, they say it gets everywhere. So don't go out, okay? Get food, sit tight, read. Just read. You like that. Make calls. Not like visits, I know. You love those friends. Nights, I hear you tell them things in my mind. Mom, I've been worried. Cabin fever. Yeah, here on the inside, we're used to that. Lots of practice. Time crawls like a broken dancer. You watch it. But Mom, what you gonna do with all that time? No visits, no go where you want, no bench in the park you like. Nights, Mom, no worry. No, you worry, okay? Me, I'm good. I'm so good.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kim. And so we just heard 3 very different poems, and obviously came from 3 very different poets, but within each of your books, I found a lot of variation as well. And I'm curious about how you curate, whether with these specific collections or other collections of yours in the past, how you curate or what thematically ties your different works together. Do you find that there is a theme, or are you just picking the ones that you like the most? Do some poems that are really, really old make their way into these newer publications? Kim, you want to take a stab at it?
Well, I'm kind of stymied. It's like asking, what is the mountain? How does the mountain construct itself? A lot of instinct, a lot of improvisation for me. Poems go in, they come out. They're spread out, move the furniture back, put them out on the floor, and one poem invites another. Then for me, a section begins to form, and then a sequence. I don't want too many long poems in a row. I already have one sort of like that. So it's like, the invitation list for a party. You want variety. You want a lively mix.
I think
I don't know how to answer. It's a lot like going into a bookstore thinking you know what you want, Lane, and then you start seeing other things, and pretty soon you need a shopping cart.
Kathleen?
Well, my second book was a book on a theme. It was all about the Hanford nuclear site. So that book wanted it from the very beginning. It was a book around a subject, and inside that subject, I played with form a lot, and that formal variation and play was what kind of gave energy to the collection, and it let me kind of look at a difficult subject from a lot of different angles. And so the first book was really, I always think of a first book as kind of like this is like a selected poems of a person who's just beginning. So these are like all the best poems I've come up with, and I'm going to try to impose on these poems some kind of theme, because that's the way books are made these days, or at least that's the way it felt to me. I kept trying to take stabs at arranging them, and I eventually did. this book was more of, this is my third book, and it was sort of a combination of the two. I thought I had a theme. I thought I knew what I was doing, but about midway through, I had a crisis, and I wasn't writing the poems I thought I was going to write. And so I realized I had to just pull back and write them one at a time. And form continues to be something I'm really interested in. I think form helps me come up with subjects sometimes. Form helps me kind of get out of my own way, because I'm concentrating on something outside of having something to say. So I rely on form a great deal to help me get the poem made.
Sai?
This is my second book, and what I did, I spread out all my poems out in the yard, and I got lawn darts, and I just threw them. Whatever hit, I put in the manuscript. No, I wish it was like that. I guess my routine is similar to Kathleen's. I kind of have a purpose. My father passed away in 2019, right before COVID, and so that left we were not on very good terms. We had an strange relationship, but that kind of, I guess, built the diving board for me to dive in. And it really was self-exploration for me about, of course, death, and which is always, it's always, out there. Iconically, but the second collection is totally different from my first collection. My first collection, I felt like I had a purpose. It was to introduce myself as a Native poet, my background, introducing my culture, what it means to be Comanche today in contemporary times, as opposed to stereotypical, horses, buffaloes, powwows, etc., etc. And the second one, it led more to like, okay, where's this river taking me? And so, but I did have times like Kathleen, like, all right, what am I doing? And the poems definitely take their own direction, and you just have to go with it. So it's like going with a stranger to a party, and they're like, well, come on, we're going to go back here. So.
Can I ask a question? So I'm so impressed with both of these books of yours, because they're both written, I think, fairly recently. Like Kim's is all about, is very much inspired by his Poet Laureate years so that's very recent. And then Sai, you just said your father's death was, if that happened 2 years ago, that means a lot of these poems are very new. I know you published in the Native, is it called Native Voices? I have the anthology where you have poems.
Yeah.
And I was reading through those, and I saw a lot of the poems from this manuscript, sometimes in slightly different forms, which I'm really fascinated by. But so I'm just really interested to hear, like, did this all come as a gush, or how did, because my book is like, took forever to write.
Well, as my first book came out in 2009, and I thought, well, this is, I'm gonna pick up momentum, and I'm gonna start like, here we go, here's some books. It wasn't like that. After I wrote that first book, I just went and didn't want to write. I got to the point where I hated poetry. Like, I did not want to do anything about it. Didn't have anything to do with it. It was like a mistress that led me astray. But Hyde, who's the editor of that anthology, she hit me up. She goes, hey, would you like to submit? And I was like, sure, why not? And so I had, at that point, one poem written. And then when she told me that, everything just clicked again, and I just started writing. That whole summer, I wrote a little bit and submitted to the anthology, and then when 2019 kicked in, and then my father, his passing, it just kind of started trucking along. Yeah.
Fantastic. And this actually segues nicely into a question that I had, and as I was reading each of your books. So there's a kind of rising genre, at least in novels, that's been dubbed autofiction. So autobiographical fiction, in the vein of like Ayad Akhtar's Homeland Elegies, which came out last year, and Knausgård's My Struggle, where it's autobiographical, but they can embellish wherever, and you really can't tell what's fiction and what's not. And I'm curious how each of you write poetry. Is it purely autobiographical, or are you kind of creating these fictional spaces to explore these things that are personal to you? And whoever has thoughts on that.
Well, for me, often there's an invitation from the world. One sort of silly example, last night I listened to Biden's speech at the joint session of Congress, and this morning when I was writing, I just thought of the phrase joint session. And I started writing this poem about everybody was toking up, and Mitch was cracking jokes from Kentucky, and Chuck Schumer had one from the Catskills, and everybody realized that Ted Cruz was kind of like the bad uncle, but that was okay. He was family, and so the language, the phrase gets me into something. And then, is that fiction? Well, damn right, it's fiction, but it's it's based on the wild, imaginative events of the world, which sometimes seem like fiction to me. I can't believe what is happening to my beloved Earth. So it's deliciously mixed up for me. And, like when I read Cy's poems, I like what Hyde said. This is, Comanche goth. And you're really out there in this weird, wonderful world. But then in the middle of the poem, you realize, wait a minute, this is truth. This is honest. This skeleton thing, this is pretty elemental. It doesn't feel, certainly not fake. It doesn't even feel made up. It feels like I've arrived at some kind of essence.
Great. Simile and metaphor for me are what it's all about. And that's where poems get their energy. And if you want to call that fiction, and actually, poetry is shelved in the fiction aisle. So you should never assume that it's true. That's what I was always told early on. Don't assume it's true, especially when you're talking to the author about it. But there has to be truth in it, it has to feel like that's the way it really hits. And that's when it's, if it gives you chills, it doesn't matter if it's a persona or what you're feeling is that this is the experience that I've had, and I know it. I've met this before.
Yeah, there's a great quote actually off of the back side of your book that a cabinet of curiosities, a descent/ascent into otherworldly realms that can only be described through the forensics of poetry. And that phrase, the forensics of poetry, is something that I spent a lot of time today thinking about. And the idea that I that resonated with me is that, or the metaphor, I guess, is like a magnifying glass under the sun. And it's not like the forensics is not that you're zooming in on something, it's that you're focusing the energy of something into something that's very pointed and specific. And that idea, I don't know, resonated with me. But and I found that when I was rereading some of your poems, side to definitely be true. Are you all ready to share another poem? Sai, you want to kick us off?
Okay. Let's see. This poem is entitled Hinterlands. My ancestors were not diligent, and so they lived beside the fort that's neither on the maps of heaven nor of hell. In these lands, there is no difference between a star and thrown car keys. Chicken nuggets hatch from the eggs of eagles. I grow dirty while bathing in bottled water. My bed comforter is a wet parking lot I wrap myself up in. If I eat in the morning, there's nothing left in the evening. My dish of grass and cigarette butts and topped with expired coupons. Stir all I like, I never swallow it down. All the while, my rabbit's foot runs about from Las Cruces to West Memphis, searching for flawless luck. The more one cries, the more one prospers. Oh, ancestral demon, may my lamentations become verbal sorcery.
Thank you. Kim?
Yeah, I just want to say, Sai, your poems, I feel like every image is so startling and arresting. I feel like stopping and just, chewing like that bite, that line, just staying with it for a while before moving on to the other. And can I ask a question? Do you sometimes have these, these iconic images one after another, and do you move them around, or do you just sort of accept them as they come?
I've moved them around, but yeah, basically just trying to capture a flow that feels comfortable when I'm reading it.
Yeah.
As it unfolds, I guess, too, how it unfolds out like a map, and I just let it roll.
Yeah. Yeah, we have limited control once
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a poem here I wrote for a friend of ours, Antonio Dominguez, who's was undocumented. He's now documented, but he really is a hardworking guy, and he's helped us a lot. And so I wrote this in the form of a letter to the president, the former president. It's called Dear Mr. President. In sheer contradiction of your efforts to warn our fellow citizens of the danger of immigrants, a certain Antonio from Michoacan, who has been living without documents as my neighbor for 15 years, has put me to shame with his work ethic, thrift, good humor, and courage, building stone walls, repairing roads, tilling gardens, and otherwise inflicting beauty and good order on this neglected corner of our nation, in spite of everything you do to drive him away. You, sir, are not getting through. He keeps smiling and bending to any task we offer for simple wages, humming a song I can't get out of my head. I do not know how to advise you, sir. You have labored long and loud to cast him down, cast him out, but he keeps humming that song. Qué linda está la mañana en que vengo a saludarte. He is saying, the morning is beautiful, sir, and he greets you, singing.
Thank you, Kim. And Kathleen?
Okay, this is I enjoy object poems. I enjoy writing them and reading them. And this is a poem. I'm really interested in why we remember the things that we do, that why this, why not that? And this is called The Lingerie Chest. It's a poem about a chest of drawers I had in my childhood bedroom. The lingerie chest. It was taller than I was, a tower. In the top drawers, out of reach and sight, handkerchiefs I never used, and dress gloves, accessories for an older girl of a previous era. In descending order, swimsuits and swim caps, nightgowns, slips, white cable knit knee-highs, and colored tights. The middle drawer opened on utilitarian cotton briefs stacked 10 days deep. Their sizes were expressed as years, 6 years, 10 years. I especially remember 12 years. They were worn, washed, then reappeared. None of my wondering was spoken. The lingerie chest was the only fine piece of furniture in my room, pale and French, between the bricks and boards bookcase and tippy wicker table. I opened and opened its drawers with their clattering brass pulls, which describes the passing of my childhood, alert for sudden lace or silk, for pink sensation, for beauty, as if growing up could be effortless. In our house, where I'd been given no names for any of this, and the words I didn't know were impossible to say. The implications of a word like lingerie.
Thank you. And
I just want to say I'm so struck by the big embrace of poetry, you know, from skeletons in the desert to slips in a drawer. Poetry welcomes all.
I love this group of you three because each of these they're all so different, and I'm having a lot of fun. So I have a question, and each of your deliveries of these poems is such a good example of this, where it's such a privilege to hear a poet deliver their own work. And I have this question has a sort of practical element to it, but also a more, I guess, spiritual is the first word that comes to mind. But I'm curious about your thoughts on what the best way to experience poetry is, and how the last year, and maybe even the last month, if you've been doing, just sprint of delivering poems during National Poetry Month, it has this sort of like Zoom landscape actually lended something to the world of shared poetry, or is there, is it a detriment?
I have to say, I feel bad, but I kind of love Zoom. I love that I'm talking to people in Bozeman and Sisters. Audiences are more varied. People don't have to drive to buy a book and listen to a poem. I love seeing faces. I wish I could see everybody who's listening. I think of poetry aloud. I think Amanda Gorman showed us at the inauguration that the poetry spoken aloud it's an anthem. It returns to its true nature. And there's a rule in a medieval monastic rule. It says, "No brother shall read while others are trying to sleep," which tells us that silent reading hadn't been invented. And I think a poetry event like this, where we hear the poem aloud, there's an authenticity to it.
I like things about Zoom too. I love being able to just turn the computer on and see a reading. And so a lot of times it'll be recorded so I can watch it when I really feel like reading, watching. And that's a real advantage. But I miss the human. I miss the room full of listeners and poets, and I think there's a little bit of, I lose some of the energy this way. So I feel a little regretful about, that's just one of the many things I feel regretful about. But I think I like poems best on the page. I'm really interested in spoken word. I mean, not personally, but I've seen the power of spoken word poetry. And I know that it reaches people that no other kind of poetry does. And I really support that. But I think for me, my relationship with poems and the way I came to it was on the page. And that's where I feel like it has the most power for me, because I'm not a very good listener. So many things miss me when I'm listening, but when I'm reading, I can go back and go back. I can reread. I can try it in the morning and try it in the afternoon. For me, that's where it is. And that's where I fell in love with it. So that's kind of my happy place, is on the page.
I kind of agree with Kim, like starting to do these readings. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Starting to do these readings, started doing the virtual thing back in February, and it was great because you did a read in New York, and later on that night, one in California, and the next day, in Texas, and caught the book festival down there. But yet, the downside to it is I'm not getting the energy from the audience, and to me, that's a real big thing, is that connection. But you don't get that connection, of course, like this. And so I really do miss that. And afterwards, being able to, people to come up, talk to you, you can go to them, and, the camaraderie, comrades and, in poetry, I miss that.
Yeah. One thing that occurs to me is when you're reading a poem on the page, in some ways you're having an experience closer to the experience of writing a poem. What Kathleen said about being able to go back and you see a word and you start to see patterns, and that's very close to what happens when you're composing something. But then once the poem is settled, to read it aloud is I don't know, I'm torn. I love books, I love the page, but I also love the alive quality of, our son, when he was about 12 years old, he said, Dad, we didn't become human when we invented tools, because when you use a tool, you just look at the tool. We became human when we looked across the fire into each other's eyes and told stories, and I think that a reading is when we return to that very ancient ritual of, looking across the fire and saying your truth.
All right, I have another question, and if anybody in the audience who's watching has questions for any of our guests, you can drop them in the Q&A section down there at the bottom. So I think that probably for each of you, well, I hope that the answer will be a little bit different, but I think that like landscape and sense of place plays a role in, or at least works its way into each of your works. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts and how the landscape either does or does not inspire each of you. Sai?
Definitely inspiring for me. In this book, I touch on that important. There's a poem about Mount Scott in here. Mount Scott is part of the Wichita Mountains, and that is in the southwestern part of Oklahoma, and they hold a very significant place for the indigenous people communities all around there. Even they've been significant to us since before pre-reservation. And so, but geography is always, it's always been like a go-to for me as well. History of a place as well is, to me, that can be intriguing. That could spark an idea for a poem. So, but it's very much, of course, it's grounding. So.
My second book, Plume, is all about Hanford and the Eastern Washington and that landscape where I was born and grew up. And I wrote about pretty much just that for several years. And this collection is a little more varied, and it's really more the landscape of memory, I would say. But I think also I think of myself as a writer about interiors, and I think that can also be considered a landscape. I think about my poems as sort of domestic poems. I stayed home and raised kids for, you know, a good chunk of my life. So that is still sort of part of what I sort of live for and about. And so I would say those are all really important influences. The interior, the landscape of my childhood, and also, you know, I live in Seattle, and I think I'm madly in love with the Northwest landscape. I've never moved away because it's so important to me. So that has to be part of my writing too.
I remember I made my living for some years being a visitor to schools and working with kids. And one of the prompts we often did was asking a young person, make a map of your home region, you know, your neighborhood. Where are the climbing trees? Where are the dangerous dogs? Where are the hiding places? You know, where do you find berries? Where the birds sing? Where did you have your first kiss? You know, it's sort of inviting the magic landscape of each person. And I think, like Cy, when he talks about Mount Scott, there can be a community sense of place. Also, for me, you know, I lost my brother, and places I used to go with my brother, they have a resonance that no one around me feels, but I feel very intensely. And so, and one other thing, when I meet someone, I find just by habit, I often say, "Where are you from?" You know, that says so much about a person. Where did you become a human being? You know, how did the earth shape you in a special way? So I'm sure that's, you know, I'm fascinated by, in writing, the sense of out of nowhere, I had this idea. Well, it's not out of nowhere. You know, it came from some resonant moment in a place, often for me, and it comes forth in an instinctive, kind of anonymous way. But I think it started as an experience in a place.
And Kathleen, you've kind of alluded to this a little bit so far in the evening, but I'm curious about how each of you made your way to poetry. And Kathleen, I think you have, particularly, at least in some of the research that I was doing, a pretty interesting journey to it.
Yeah, I had 2 degrees in engineering, and I worked in engineering until I had our second son, and then I decided to stay home with the kids. And so that was when I went to the library and picked out that book, and, you know, it sort of discovered poetry, and then took a poetry night class. And so I was sort of learning poetry while the kids were small. And it was a great way to enter it. It's not a good way for feeling confident or feeling like you're legitimate. I mean, it's not very good for that. But for feeling like there's a use for all that time where you've got a baby on a knee, and, you know, it's like my mind was just bubbling with poems. I was so in love with poetry, and that was a great way to come to it.
Yeah.
Cy?
I was held at gunpoint. Someone said, write a poem. No. I was a artist, worked in acrylics, and did that since I was in high school, and did for a couple of years. And I started reading Joy Harjo and James Wright. For some reason, someone left a book, basically, a book of poetry, and that's how I kind of grasped onto it and just took off. It kind of, I guess, I use that part of being an artist, a painter, kind of use those skills in writing the poems. But I really started learning about wordplay and the power of language, and how you know, a line can be so detrimental to a poem or to a piece of fiction. And Just, I just fell in love with that magic of it.
Kim?
Yeah, I'm thinking when Kathleen talks about holding the baby and the mind on fire, there's a writer here in Portland, Gary Miranda, who said one time, people who don't read or write poetry are spared the inconvenience of thought. And if your mind is filled with thoughts, poetry is a place to go, either to write or to read and be enlivened, be accompanied by the inner life. One of my students said, hey, you have a public life, you have a private life, and you have a secret life. And poetry is one of the places that, is kind of a courier going back and forth between the public, private, and secret life. And so it's, I don't know what size count too. I have a friend, Monica Drake, here in Portland, who started as a painter, and while she was painting, she would be thinking, and her thinking started to become stories, and then she got more interested in the stories than the painting and turned to writing novels. So I think this fluid search for what is the kind of activity that helps me honor and engage with my inner life, and it'll be different for different people. But I think poetry, because poems are relatively short and there are a lot of them, it's kind of a happy hunting ground for what speaks to your soul.
Absolutely.
I always wondered, Kim, did you know about that you wanted to do poetry from the very beginning? I mean, it's very intimidating to have your father.
Yeah, but my dad, his writing life was completely invisible because he did it before it got light. And these books would appear out of nowhere, like where did that come from? Because he was just our daddy. He made bows and arrows, and he liked to bake bread and work in the garden, and he was a teacher. He wasn't really a poet to us as kids. He was just our dad.
I'd love to ask each of you all to share 2 poems this time. If you've got them, each of you can just do 2 back to back. Kathleen, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I referenced the landscape of the interiors of house interiors, so I'll do something along that line. Let's see. Okay, here's one to start. This is called Intimacy. You only get this haircut from the barber who sleeps with you. It's the endless attention to your ears and eyebrows. It's the wrestling moves. I wield shears, talk brusquely with my hands, cut off your curls with your head braced between my breasts as you sit almost calmly. Your bald spot is the view from a glass-bottom boat. No sign of me down there. Once on a beach vacation, you and I watched a wife with scissors move across her husband's scalp in a sarong. It ought to have been private, the way she shaved his neck and sideburns. If I pinch with the electric razor or pull your hair, you'll grab my wrist and tear the tablecloth off your shoulders. If I'm careful, you'll accept your haircut with a nod. This is intimacy. What was I pining for? And let's see. This is called Poem Ending with Lines from a Charlie Brown Christmas. I enter my childhood home, a newly minted 40-year-old orphan, desiring everything. Rifling through the kitchen junk drawer and the auxiliary rubber band drawer and the third drawer full of twist ties and styrofoam meat trays. I want, like a robber, the silverware and the encyclopedia set. I want my mother's sense of her own beauty. I want the sound of the house settling at night. I'm the baby of the family. I want my brothers to love me more than I deserve. I'm taking the sugar and creamer engraved with Shakespeare. To thine own self be true, and actions speak louder than words. I want the prizes at the bottom of every box of cereal ever eaten here. Before we sell the house with its dear ghosts and take our turn growing old, I insist on one last game of risk, and this time I will not cry and will demonstrate strategy. All I want is what I have coming to me. All I want is my fair share.
I love both of those. I'm glad that you picked both of those to share. Kim?
Yeah. Wow, I want this to go on and on. This is such a privilege to be with fellow poets. Well, I have another one from prison visit. I was at Two Rivers Prison up in Umatilla in Eastern Oregon. And I guess it's called Two Rivers because the Umatilla and the Columbia are confluent near there. And so I sat with a group of gentlemen, and they talked about not being with their kids and, being very homesick. And so I wrote this poem for them called Two Rivers. One river flows above ground. Everyone can see it shining across the land, following the valley, shaping the valley, never at rest. And some people say, I know who you are. I know what you've done, what you lost, where you came from, where you are going. I know. But what do they know of you, really? For another river flows below all that, invisible, at the speed of a dream inside you, intuitive, curious, innocent. And you say, I know who I want to be. I know what I've learned. I know what I love. I need to know who I really am. So you remember, you wonder, you write, you shape story, and you say to yourself on the page, hidden river, spill your secrets at the wellspring. I hold forth my cup, no one else can see. And this other one, really following, again, Elizabeth Woody, who the poem serves. I have a friend who lost her husband, and so I wrote this poem for her. It's called Song After Ishiguro, the novelist, and he has a line somewhere, there was another life I might have had, but I am having this one. So Song After Ishiguro. To glimpse the roads I never walked, my heart begins to spin. I carry wayward stories of all that might have been. If I were starting over, would I take this life again? Can I savor satisfaction for all I hold within? Win or lose is not the game. With every breath, begin. Those were the lives I might have lived, but this is the one I'm in.
Thank you, Kim. Sai?
Yay. No, I had it. Okay, here we go. This poem's entitled Six Fingers. They say the snake is a severed tail of a vast and dangerous creature of filth and fog. I can relate to that. I am the cutoff, the stump. My life at best is a severed hand with six fingers, a skinny cardinal for a wedding ring. My blood trail disappears up into the trees, into the sky, into the next world. The starry hand of dawn, and all six fingers pointing in six different directions, fingering goodbye. And undecided, I sit here long enough to become an altar where the abandoned monsters come to pray. My temple of 100 wildernesses, shining like the edges of a viper's eye. The offerings, dead spiders, hummingbirds, and crispy sun-soaked leaves raked out of the cemetery lawns. Talking about location and earlier. I'm going to read. This one poem. It's about location, I guess. Jagged winter trail designs. The wagon and mule, time and eternity, stop to change places. Their lean slope back shadow, my reservation. The moon moves like infested flower. At the river, bloody victories meet bloody massacres. They tell each other about their dead. Grandmothers eat buffalo instead of hamburger. After supper, guitar chords bite through gravestone. Then the one grandfather interrupts, walking off with his own skull as a lantern into the polar night. The snowshoe hare cleans the ears of the sleeping and leaves prophetic dreams. It is quiet. One can hear the hair of the dead grow. The woods itself are dressed in frozen children's clothes. And few of the living disguise themselves as pond beadwork. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, all of these poems are so good. I'm so excited for myself for doing the research on this event and getting exposed to all of this. We have a question from the audience. What do you read when you're looking for inspiration, whether that's other poets or books, authors? Anybody who wants to jump in?
Cereal boxes. No, definitely other poets. There's so much poetry out there that I just can't, I can't keep up. And then, every summer, my routine is to, summer's coming up, or warmer weather, I guess. I usually go back to a favorite of mine, and that starts off my reading list. So I'm starting with Anne Carson's The Autobiography of Red, which is prose poems, I guess, a little bit. It's a unique piece of work, definitely. So.
Good one.
Awesome.
I find that question so hard. My mind immediately goes blank.
Yeah.
I am actually part of a poetry book club with 7 other wonderful poets. And so once a month we read a book together, and we really dig into it, and we read background information and interviews, and then just the act of talking about it together it gets us deeper and deeper into a book. And that is so inspiring, because it's you go further down that path than you ordinarily do. Even if you're very inspired, you only have yourself to talk to sometimes when you're reading a book. And this, I don't know, I just find that wonderful experience. I loved these 2 books. I loved Sai's book and I loved Kim's book. We recently read Adam Zagajewski's book, Asymmetry. He just died. That one was very inspiring to me recently. Probably the best book I read last year, I thought, was by Alice Oswald, called Nobody. I just loved that book. She's a British poet. But yeah, there's just so much going on. It's crazy and Kim mentioned Gary Miranda. He's the translator, my favorite translator of the Duino Elegies, which is one of Rilke's collections, and that was another really big inspiration when I was writing the poems in Post-Romantic. So it's kind of fun to hear his name evoked while we're talking.
Well, inspiration is, I think of the composer Bach. His students asked him, Papa Bach, where do you get your melodies? And he said, "Oh, my child, I stumble over them getting out of bed." The inspiration is so everywhere. The language around us, you hear a phrase you've heard 1,000 times and you, wait a minute, that's interesting. What is that? So, for me, it's a little notebook. I'm always writing things down. I just had the phrase go through my mind yesterday, no one left to ask. I'm the elder in my family now, which is a really odd, unfortunate thing. And so that phrase, no one left to ask, that is begging to be, I don't know yet, an essay, a story, a song. In terms of reading, Joy Harjo is, oh my gosh, what an inspiration. Not only her writing, but the writings that she's bringing together for us. Ross Gay, The Book of Delights, the way he so fluidly goes between essay and poem, and his idea of, I'm going to write an essay every day for a year. I'm going to spend 30 minutes. That's a very attractive kind of rigor. But I think in the days ahead, I'll be reading Cy and Kathleen, and electric things are going to happen. Who knows?
Book of Delights by Ross Gay is such a joy, and over the last year was one that we sold a lot of because there were people coming to the store going, I just need something kind of, uplifting, and that is such an easy hand sell. And his the way that he does shift, and you can hear him reading it to you.
And he's such a lesson too, just what we're talking about now, inspiration. He's sitting in a coffee shop, he sees the sign, no loitering. He starts thinking about loitering, and pretty soon he's into a race and being the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that sense of the springs of discovery are all around us, and poetry is one way to just say yes to any suggestive beginning.
Absolutely. And so I have, as we get close to wrapping up, I have one last question here that actually, Kathleen, your mention of the book club kind of made me think of this, and I know, there's a bit of duality here that's certainly possible, but when you're writing, is it a solitary act for you, or are you thinking of the community and the people that will read it and share it, and are you thinking of the act of sharing it? Does it feel a social act, or does it feel a solitary act?
Well, I actually sometimes write with friends when I haven't been producing very much work, so that's been one way. And even just Zoom writing together, I've done that with friends. And but even when I'm writing with someone, for me, it's very private. I mean, it's very personal and private. It's not, I never write for an audience. I'm never writing because if I did, it would just shut me down completely. I mean, I'm very, I'm like Cy's line. I am shy, like the corner of the basement. I'm shy of the idea of putting the work out there, and I need a kind of space between the writing and then the publication, if that ever happens. Those are two very separate things, and we'll leave it there.
Cy?
Very solitary. Yeah. And with that, but it's kind of contradicting too, because you're like, well, you sent the manuscript to get published, and so it must be not that much, solidarity there, or so. But you get to a point with the book, you feel like you want to share, you want to have it. It's like sending your kid to kindergarten. You're just pushing out the door, and it has a life of its own. So
I think of a story a friend of mine in Alaska told me. She writes a lot of poems, and then well, why should I inflict these on the world? Why should anyone have to read these? And, she's very self-effacing. And so Rinpoche was coming through town, a Buddhist, scholar. And so she made an appointment and she poured out her heart to this Rinpoche. I have these poems, but I just keep them to myself. And Rinpoche said, "Oh, Wendy, you must deliver the mail. These have come to you. You must deliver them. It would be very wrong to keep them in your bag." And so that idea, I think my experience being Poet Laureate changed me. I am a servant of the people. And when the pandemic started, I started writing and posting a poem on Instagram every day. And I've been doing it since a year ago, March. And in a way, it's quick and dirty. They're not all great, but I feel when I had to cancel my last 25 events, I just thought I want to connect with people. And some longer things, I keep and work over, but I'm sort of on this jag right now of write it, put it out there, move on.
Love it. Well,
That's so interesting.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and to our guests. It really has been a privilege, and I could talk to you all for hours. Do make sure that you get your hands on all of their books. Singer Come From Afar by Kim, and Ancestral Demon of a Grieving Bride, and last but not least, Post Romantic. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to catch all of you in person sometime in the future. Have a lovely evening and enjoy the upcoming weekend.
Hey,
Thank
Cy
you
and
so
Kathleen,
much.
let's stay in touch. And thank you, Elaine. And